Let's jump right in. Today, we're taking a highly focused look at a truly fascinating theological source document. If you've spent any time reading the historical letters of the Apostle Paul, you already know his writings can sometimes feel like, well, a giant puzzle. Now, our goal today isn't to debate theology. Instead, we're just going to objectively unpack this source material and see exactly how it structures one of the most intensely debated topics in biblical history: the complex relationship between the law, the Torah, and grace. We've got a brilliant roadmap ahead to help untangle this, so let's get started. Okay, let's dive into this. Right off the bat, we are faced with a massive central paradox. Basically, did Paul cancel the Torah? Readers for centuries have hit an absolute brick wall right here. You see, in some letters, Paul completely insists that believers are totally free from the law. But then, in other places, he seems to command this strict adherence to righteous living. It's the kind of dilemma that honestly makes a lot of people wonder if Paul was just, contradicting himself. And that brings us to the immediate contradiction that really forms our intellectual hook for today's explainer of the source text. Take a look at Romans chapter 3. Paul explicitly states that believers are justified by faith. But then he turns right around and asks, do we then nullify the law by this faith? His answer? An emphatic not at all. Rather, we uphold the law. I mean, think about that. How on earth can someone be completely free from a law while at the exact same time upholding it? It sounds literally impossible until you see how the underlying system actually works. To untangle this knot, we're relying on a comprehensive source framework as our map today. What's so great about this material is that it systematically breaks down Paul's arguments contextually. It doesn't just cherry-pick random verses out of nowhere. It actually builds a solid structure showing exactly how the apostle defined his terms. So we're going to walk through this together step by step to finally get some clarity. Here's a quick look at our agenda to resolve the paradox. First, the dilemma of law and grace. Second, key biblical verses. Third, what it means to be not under the Torah. Fourth, the transition of salvation history. Fifth, comparing the old and new. And finally, conclusions and practical application. Part 1, the dilemma of law and grace. These are the main principles of Paul's teachings. Before we can even look at specific verses, we really have to establish the foundational rules of Paul's worldview, at least according to our source material here. Because if we don't get these basic definitions right from the start, everything else is just going to be super confusing. The source lays out 3 main principles. Number 1, salvation is not achieved by obeying the Torah, but entirely by faith in Yeshua. But then, the second point is absolutely crucial. The Torah still declares God's enduring standard of righteousness. It hasn't just been tossed in the trash. And that leads directly to the third principle, which is basically the key to unlocking this whole puzzle. Believers are freed from the punishment of the law, right? But they are not freed from the standard of God's righteousness. It's so important to keep that separation in mind. Salvation on one hand versus the enduring standard of truth on the other. Part 2, key verses of Paul's teachings. We're analyzing the biblical texts. Let's move to and see how this builds with the specific texts that usually cause the most confusion. These are the heavy hitters from Romans and Galatians. First up is Romans 6. Paul writes, "You are not under the law, but under grace." Now, if you take that totally out of context, it sounds like a free pass to do whatever you want, right? But look at his very next sentence. Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? By no means. He explicitly and quite forcefully rejects the idea that grace is somehow a license for lawlessness. Being under grace doesn't mean the rules of right and wrong have just magically disappeared. Next, our source brings us to Romans 7, where Paul uses this famous phrase, died to the law. What does that actually mean? Well, according to the breakdown, being dead to the law means being released from the specific condemning bond that demands absolute perfect obedience under the terrifying threat of punishment. It's kind of like a legal contract that has finally been fulfilled. You're no longer bound by the nasty penalty clause of that old contract, which actually frees you up to serve in a completely new life-giving way. Then we get this brilliant metaphor in Galatians 3. The Torah functioned as a guardian or a tutor. And we have to remember, in the ancient world, a tutor wasn't just somebody who helped you with your homework. It was a strict disciplinarian who practically escorted a child everywhere to keep them out of trouble until they grew up. The Torah acted as this temporary, highly strict guardian leading humanity straight to the Messiah. But once faith arrived, the era of that strict, punitive guardianship officially ended. Moving on to part 3, the meaning of not under the Torah. This is where we separate myth from fact. Now, what's really interesting about this breakdown is how it totally dismantles some major misconceptions. Since that guardianship era is over, what exactly does Paul mean when he says believers are not under the Torah? It's time to take down some straw man arguments here. Not under the law absolutely does not mean you are suddenly free to sin. It doesn't mean the Torah is suddenly invalid, and it for sure doesn't mean you can just live however you want. Actually, scratch that. It's more like this. The factual reality is that it means you are no longer under the law's curse. You've been released from its punishment, and you've entered into a brand new relationship based entirely on grace, not on your own performance.
Part 4, Salvation History Transition. Let's look at the timeline of Yeshua's redemption.
To really grasp how this all works logically, we have to zoom out and look at the timeline. Paul's seemingly contradictory statements regarding the law actually start to make perfect sense once you view them through the lens of historical redemption. The source maps it out beautifully in 3 phases. Phase 1 is before Yeshua. The Torah was given through Moses primarily to reveal human sin, basically proving that literally no one could obey it perfectly. Then, phase 2, Yeshua comes. He is born under the Torah, lives a life perfectly obeying it, and then steps in to redeem humanity from the curse of breaking it. Which brings us to the turning point, phase 3, after Yeshua. Now, believers are justified by faith, released from that ancient curse, and given the Holy Spirit so they finally have the internal power to obey God's true will. The historical arrival of the Messiah literally reshaped. Part 5, Comparing the Old and New, a total paradigm shift in obedience. Because of that massive historical shift, the believer's entire paradigm of obedience totally changes. Let's compare them directly to make these abstract theological concepts super concrete. Consider the motivation to obey. Under the old system of the law, obedience was largely forced out of a fear of punishment, right? But under the new system of grace, obedience is driven purely by love. And where does the power even come from? Well, in the old paradigm, you relied entirely on your own flawed human strength to keep the rules, which usually didn't go well. But in the new paradigm, you're empowered by the Holy Spirit. It is a complete 180 from a forced, self-reliant system to a love-driven, spirit-empowered life. The law hasn't vanished at all. The way we interact with it is what's been entirely transformed. Part 6, Conclusion and Practical Application. Living out grace and truth. So, the crucial point is, how does this actually affect daily life? Because theology is just empty theory if it doesn't change how we live. According to our source material, the practical takeaways are huge. First off, your daily motivation entirely shifts. You aren't doing the right thing because you're terrified of a lightning bolt from the sky. You do it simply because you love God. Second, the moral principles of the Torah actually remain an incredibly helpful guide for life. And third, you stop exhausting yourself trying to be perfect all on your own, and instead lean on the strength of the Spirit. As Paul famously wrote, love is the fulfillment of the law. The ultimate goal here isn't to pick a side in some imaginary war between law and grace. It's to accept them both in their proper transformative order, receiving the free gift of grace first, which then actually empowers you to live a life of true righteousness. And this brilliantly illustrates the final resting place for us today. Romans 8:1. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Messiah Yeshua. The paradox is officially resolved. The law remains good, it remains true, and it remains the standard. But the terror of its condemnation, that is permanently gone for the believer. You aren't just free to sin, you are finally free to love. I really hope this structured walkthrough has clarified Paul's complex teachings for you, and maybe even sparked a desire to go read these ancient texts with fresh eyes. So I'll leave you with this final thought. If ultimate grace completely removes the fear of punishment, how exactly will that change the way you choose to live your life tomorrow? Thanks for exploring this with me.